Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of a few books that I read that were centered around food preparation, eating, and all of that. And that's to say, not recipe books or cookbooks, although many of these books do have recipes in them, but books that deal more with the social side of food and the personal side of food and the meaning of food and all that. The first one that I picked up was another book in Coach House Books' Exploded Views series. This one is called The Trouble with Brunch: Work, Class, and the Pursuit of Leisure. This is written by Shawn Micallef, and there are basically two pieces to this, one of which I thought was very compelling and one of which seemed ridiculous. The compelling part is that he's trying to talk about the way individuals, families, communities approach food and eating from a social perspective. So both your family dinner, going out to eat, the formal versus informal restaurant choices. And he tries to talk about that from a perspective of what it means in terms of class and region, but it doesn't completely work because his central idea involves defining the middle class in a way that is probably not descriptive of the Canadian middle class. It is in fact descriptive of some obnoxious artistic hipsters in Toronto, basically. I think he could have even described it as a creative class as opposed to a middle class thing, but because he's using that terminology, it all falls apart because it's ridiculous because the population that he's talking about is not middle class Canadians or even middle class people in Toronto. It is specifically artists of a certain generation in a certain area. So that didn't work. However, interwoven with that is basically his history with food. So he's the son of Maltese immigrants and grew up in a working class area where almost everybody was second generation Croatian and Italian. So he had this very Mediterranean food culture where most of the families around him were cooking, and when their families went out to eat, they would go to these banquet halls, and it had a very particular meaning. And then he talks about moving to Toronto as an adult, and because he's a writer and because he's working in a creative area, he falls in with this group of creatives who are basically going to overpriced lunch places because that's kind of the trendy thing to do. And he extrapolates from that to a larger social picture that I didn't believe in the slightest. It didn't speak to reality to me at any level. But the specific stories about him negotiating that cultural shift of the meaning of food, where he grew up and what that meant as it changed over time and over geography and as education levels changed and all of that was all really interesting. So I was almost disappointed that instead of writing this book, which I think failed to back up his overarching thesis, if you will, for this, and I wish this was a memoir, because if he had written a memoir about his relationship with food and how that evolved over his life as he moved from this working class family to this neighborhood where he's working with these creatives in a different kind of situation, I think that would have been really compelling because the parts where he is talking about memoir-esque things are great. But unfortunately, this idea that middle-class people go to overpriced brunches was ridiculous. Just because plenty of middle-class people go for the $2.99 breakfast at Markham Station. And you know, there are chains like Cora's and Egg Smart, and people go to that. They don't all go to these tiny hipster overpriced things. It was ridiculous, and it made me think that the publishers are in a bit of a creative bubble themselves, that they okayed this because it's such a ridiculous central argument. And I think even if it was just a creative class statement, it would have been stretching it a bit. But to have it be a statement about the Canadian middle class is absurd, and which is such a shame because the memoir-y bits of this were excellent. Next up, I read another book in Coach House's series, which, having just read the other book, I was a bit cynical because I was starting to think they will publish anything because that book was such nonsense. But this one surprised me. This is A Matter of Taste, a farmer's market devotee's semi-reluctant argument for inviting scientific innovation to the dinner table by Rebecca Tucker. This is interesting because it starts out from almost a similar perspective to the other book in that she talks about her family's food history, because her mother was an Italian immigrant who did a lot of the things that Shawn Micallef's family's neighbors did, with a lot of gardening and a lot of cooking and that kind of perspective, and her father was Anglo-Canadian and had the kind of family where they ate cereal and whatnot. And she has kind of the same thing of talking about, you know, moving into this kind of downtown hipster circle. And I genuinely was sitting there going, okay, this is going to be another one. And it wasn't. She actually dug into what I guess is the unsustainability of a lot of sustainability movements, where she points out that a lot of the people who don't want a No Frills, for example, which is a low-end grocery chain that we have here, in their neighborhoods and look down their noses at that and want to shop at this organic farmer's market. But for the average person, never mind somebody living on the poverty level, having to shop that way would essentially be making the trade-off between a small organic onion and, you know, a week's worth of food, for example. And so she talks about how that is a choice that people just can't make most of the time on that level. She also then goes into the fear of genetically modified foods and then the potential of that, and how it's great to kind of present this as an individual choice. And if everybody did this, which they can't afford to do, you wouldn't need to have, for example, genetically modified crops, which might absorb different nutrients in the ground, for example. That's one of the examples is about tubers that are able to grow that have been engineered to grow in environments where they wouldn't be, and how that is certainly more sustainable in terms of feeding people in a wider variety of areas, versus this very one-sided view that really can't see outside its little bundle of class and location and having a certain default amount of money that you can afford to talk about sustainability in a way that would not be sustainable for most people. And she does a reasonable job of presenting various points in a small little package. So I thought that was very successful, and especially considering how much it had in common with the previous book. I thought it was so much better researched. It made me less worried about picking up more books in that particular series from that publisher. Because the trouble with Brunch genuinely had me thinking, why would somebody publish this as it is? But this one, quite good. After that, I read The Cooking Gene by Michael W. Twitty. He is the chef and writer who did the Southern Discomfort tour, and a big part of his drive is reclaiming the slave origins of a lot of Southern cooking, where one of the points is that a lot of traditional Southern cookbooks were written by white women, but were based on the recipes that their cook, or in books published prior to the 1860s, their slave, would have actually invented. And how this style of Southern cooking that mixes West European, West African, and then North and Central American cooking styles really merged because of that specific tradition. And so he tries to uncover both the history of that alongside the history of his family. So as he's looking into the history of a dish or a style of cooking, or the way particular vegetables made their way one way or the other across the Atlantic, he also looks at the history of his own family and visits the places where they lived, and essentially is using food as a way to meet his ancestors. And I thought this was really brilliantly successful in almost everywhere. There is a point at the end where he goes to Europe because he had one ancestor who was the child of a slave woman and her owner. So he goes to see where that person who was of English and Scottish heritage, so he goes to the UK to see where those people were, and he talks quite a bit about going back to places that he's determined that his West African ancestors had come from. But the book ends before he gets to make that journey, and that felt a little like there was something missing. Like we were missing this chapter where he would have gone to Ghana or gone to Nigeria. Because the way the book was built up, I fully expected it to end with that. So when it didn't, and it ended with this trip to Europe, it felt like there was a missing chapter. This one, unlike the other two books, does include a number of recipes, which are great. I think it's great to have kind of the social and the historical context of these food items, and then to see what that food would look like and what's involved in cooking it. There's also a lot of personal social commentary, things about traveling within the North and the South and the way food is perceived and the way food is perceived racially or not, and sometimes in the wrong ways or the right ways, or stereotypes that might be true, but they're not true for the reasons that people expect, and he explains a lot of things like that. He talks a lot about cooking, where men cooked and where women cooked, and he talks a bit about how he had some family members who viewed his fondness for cooking almost suspiciously and as something effeminate that was viewed negatively. But really the focus is more so on family history and then food. There is a chapter where he talks a lot about DNA testing, which is great in that he's trying to pinpoint exactly what ethnic groups his ancestors who were brought over to the US as slaves would have come from. And it was interesting because he's doing different tests and trying to see what overlaps. And this was published a few years ago. I think the tricky thing about any kind of writing about DNA testing is that so much of that changes all the time. I mentioned in a video once before that I've actually done a DNA test, not for ethnicity reasons. My sister just had a number of people mistake her husband for her brother and wondered if we might secretly be really distant cousins. We're not distant cousins. Because when you do that, and I did use a fake name, so, you know, staying anonymous. But anyway, about 6 months ago, I guess, I got an email from the company saying, oh, we've updated this. Because when I talked about it before, I did look at the ethnicity part just to see what it looked like. And it was like 17 different categories across all of Europe, West and Central Asia, and North Africa. 17 categories, right? So when they did the January update, it's now 4. And as someone who knows a lot about my family history, that was fine. They looked correct. The 4 were 2 overlapping groups, like, there's Northwestern Europe and there's Northwest Asia. Hey. Which is not surprising to me, and I'm not basing anything on that because, like I said, I was just finding out that my brother-in-law is not my cousin. That sounds so dumb. But anyway, with that in mind, thinking about him doing all these tests and having these revelations 2 years ago, and I just thought, they've probably changed a lot of that. Which is not to be cynical about things like that, because I think, you know, I've talked to a lot of people who have found estranged relatives or missing relatives and stuff like that, and I think that's brilliant. But the whole, I have found my region, it just made me think, well, what if they've changed that since then? Just because that's what I saw. But in any case, I thought this was a brilliant exploration of family and food and history and how that all goes together. And finally, I've been reading this series of comics, Boire et manger by Guillaume Long. This is a comic series. The author is a food writer for Le Monde, and he travels quite a bit to evaluate restaurants and to write about food styles and whatnot. And this series is a lot of fun. It combines basically stories and cooking. This is volume 2. I don't have the first volume out of the library anymore. The first one has a great piece that illustrates how to use an Italian coffee maker perfectly as long as you have a gas stove, because you can look at the way the flame hits on, and it's just perfect. And it's the kind of material that it would be very difficult to do in a non-comic format. And I love those elements. Now that's not exclusively what this is. Some of this is about his travels. Like this is about, I think, his trip to Sweden, this part, yeah. And it's fine. It's a little obnoxious because, and I guess maybe that's a stereotype of food writers, that you think they have to be a bit of a snob. So that wasn't as, bits of that could be fun, but bits of it were a little cringeworthy. But I still overall really love this series. I think it's great. You know, it has this little, here's instructions to make spaghetti. And you might think, well, it has to be very easy to make spaghetti. But I think some of that is wonderful. But I really like that it has kind of the simple things and the complicated things and all of that. In the first one, and now I'm regretting that I dropped it off before talking about it. In the first one, there's also a bit about what utensils one should have to be able to cook properly. His examples were someone who's just moving out of their parents' house or someone who's just been divorced from their foodie spouse who did all the cooking. But yeah, I think this is definitely worth reading in English. This is called To Eat or to Drink, or To Eat and to Drink. That makes more sense. And I think the covers are nicer on the English edition. I think they're more representative of what they actually are, because I think the cover of the English one is like pieces of food in the style of the book itself. Whereas I feel like with a cover like this, it's harder to know what you're gonna get. Yeah, I definitely recommend this if you are a fan of food writing and you want to see the behind the scenes of food writing as well as picking up some recipes, because I really loved this stuff about the coffee maker. But maybe that's just because I'm a crazy coffee person. So if you read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought about it. I know Yvette from Book Cave did a really thorough review of the Cooking Gene, and I'll link to that below because I think if you want to hear more about that, it's worth listening to a longer review of that. If you've read any interesting food writing lately, I'd love to hear what you've read. If you've read anything that sounds similar about food and history or food and society, I'd love to hear what you were reading and what you thought of it. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.